Hey, everybody. Happy Wednesday morning from the Podcast Daily. It is that time again. Bill Landis is back with me, Austin Ward, and we have more questions because there is another Media Day down here in Atlanta. So we're going to let Bill uh, give us the ammunition that we need to go out and get the answers that he needs and you all desperately want as Ohio State gets ready for Saturday night in the Peach Bowl against Georgia. So we've knocked out the offense. We've had the arrival on Monday from Ohio State. And now, Bill, it is time to look at this interesting matchup with Ohio State's defense, Silver Bullets, trying to bounce back from that fourth quarter last month against Michigan. I know they're sick of hearing it, and match up with Georgia, which, as you have pointed out several times, probably a lot more dangerous offensively than they tend to get credit for.
Yeah, they're really good. And probably flies under the radar because of how good Georgia's defense is, understandably so. I want to ask. I was watching the live stream of the offensive press conferences on Tuesday, and someone asked Kevin Wilson for some reason about stopping Georgia's offense. So I would like to ask Jim Knowles about preparing to go against Georgia's defense to keep the theme alive, to keep the nonsensical theme alive, because I don't know what you get out of that. Kevin Wilson, to his credit, gave a good answer because Kevin Wilson likes to talk, and it doesn't really matter what you ask him. But I don't know why we're asking the opposing offensive coordinator about the other team's offense.
This is what happens when you're not around to grab the microphone and make sure that there's some semblance of normalcy in a press conference. This is your fault, Bill.
Yeah, I'll take the blame for that. I suppose. It is. We've correct me if I'm wrong. We've not talked to Jim Knowles right since the Michigan game. He came up post game, and we haven't talked to him since.
That's right.
So I mean, there's a lot to dig into with him. Then I don't know. At this point, probably like a full-on post-mortem of the Michigan game is probably unnecessary and certainly something I'm sure he doesn't want to do when they're a couple days away from playing in the Peach Bowl semifinal. But I would be curious about what he learned coming out of that. And I remember like earlier in the year, the thing I like about Jim Knowles is like he almost begrudgingly so sometimes, but like he likes to tell stories about like past instances in his career that sort of inform what he's doing now. I remember we were talking about like the lack of turnovers Ohio State had earlier in the year, and he's like, well, there was one year where I had back-to-back games where we had a dozen turnovers or a dozen takeaways, and we gave up like 110 points in those back-to-back games. So I'm wondering now if he, that was probably or certainly wasn't his defense's finest hour against Michigan. And I wonder if he's had experiences like that in the past where he just got really burned on big plays like that, and maybe how it informed sort of how he bounced back from that, how he progressed forward from there. Because you wrote a story last week at OhioState.Rivals.com, and I've kind of touched on it a little bit too. Like, what do you do when your aggression kind of gets turned against you when you're someone like Jim Knowles? Do you ratchet it back, or do you stay true to who you are? And I'm kind of curious where Jim Knowles is with that at the moment.
Yeah, I think my feeling on that, and I'm sure that this will be something that Jim Knowles addresses directly, is that you can't. He's been doing this long enough, and he has a large enough body of work and sample size and experience to draw from that you could say, well, it didn't work this time, but it doesn't mean that the system is broken or irreparably damaged, or you have to go to the next game and do the exact opposite of what you did before and suddenly become conservative. Like, that wasn't what he was hired to do at Ohio State. And part of this philosophy that he brings is that 5 explosive plays are going to happen. We talked about that going into the spring. We talked about that in September. We talked about it in October. We talked about it in November. Obviously, what happened against Michigan is that those 5 explosives all turned into touchdowns, and that you simply cannot have happen. But on the same token, if you try and go out there and play against Georgia and say, well, you're going to sit back in a cover 2 shell and force Stetson Bennett to go up and down the field and then hope that you don't break in the red zone. Like, that doesn't seem like a smart strategy. And it also doesn't fit with what Ohio State's overall approach is, which is Ryan Day wanting to make sure that his offense is on the field and getting as many opportunities as possible to put up points. Like, all this stuff is supposed to fit hand in hand. You want your defense to be aggressive so that they can try and steal a turnover, maybe score on it, create confusion and chaos for the quarterback. And if it's not a 3 and out, sometimes a fast drive that scores is not the worst thing in the world if your offense gets to go back out there. Not advocating that Ohio State should do that or that Jim Knowles wants anybody to score, but this was a conscious effort going into it to play a much more aggressive style and accept the risk on both sides of the football.
Yeah, they want to be in your face, and it's as we talked about when Jim Knowles got hired, and kind of throughout this year, it was a flip, like pretty much a full like 180 from where they were previously under Ryan Day. Full 180, I guess, does not make sense, but it was a 180 from where Ryan Day was
It was
previously.
a half 360.
It was a half 360, an about face, if you will, and they just don't. Jim Knowles does not want to be a bend but don't break kind of defense. Ohio State lived in that world. And it was kind of okay when you have a Chase Young, and it was less okay after Chase Young left. I think they want to try to set the terms as a defense, and sometimes that does lead to you getting burned. Part of what happened against Michigan almost feels like an anomaly to me. Like how many games are you going to play where a team scores touchdowns on that many big plays? I think not many. If you played that game 10 times, but it probably doesn't happen again if you play it out that way. Not to excuse it because it happened and they lost, but I think if you're Jim Knowles, like maybe the scar that we're assuming exists from a game like that maybe doesn't exist for Jim Knowles, just because he's lived in that world for 30 plus years now, and he knows that sometimes that's just going to happen. And maybe the worst thing you can do when something like that happens is kind of totally abandon who you are and what got you there. So I don't expect Ohio State to scrap that idea entirely, but I think there is probably something between all out aggression and being passive, and guys like Ronnie Hickman and Tanner McAllister were kind of talking about that when we had the on-campus media day about picking your spots a little better. And I wonder if Jim Knowles might do that in this game, but I don't think if Ohio State sits back on its heels and tries to, confine Georgia's offense and then hope to stand up in the red zone, I think you're asking for a bad day. I think you have to try to pressure Stetson Bennett in a way he hasn't been pressured before, and get up in their face and try to be an aggressor against a team that's really good and frankly probably hasn't played very many defenses that were up to the task. So we'll see if Ohio State's is, but it does put Jim Knowles in an interesting spotlight given what just happened to him the last time Ohio State was out on the field.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even think that Georgia's a team that you want to mess with in the red zone that much, because they're so their personnel is ideally suited for working in small spaces, whether that's with the rushing attack or Stetson Bennett using his legs, or I think probably your next question, what you do with those two tight ends, because that's where they're most dangerous. You get them into those confined spaces and they can dictate what personnel the defense is using, and they can either be flexed out and make plays happen as wide receivers, or obviously block for a rushing attack that's pretty good.
There's a lot to worry about with it's not just they'll hand the ball off to Brock Bowers. What do you do? What are you supposed to do against that? They don't do it a ton, but every time they do it, it seems to be effective. And they weaponize those guys in really fun and creative and difficult, I'd imagine, to stop ways when you're a defensive coordinator. So yeah, I wouldn't want to live in a world where it's okay, we're in the red zone, let's stop them now. It just doesn't seem like it'd work out very well. I wonder too, to that point, to your point about the tight ends, what is applicable from playing Michael Mayer to this game? And I thought they had a really good plan against Michael Mayer when they played Notre Dame in the opener, but that's also an offense where you don't really have to worry about much else other than Michael Mayer, and Georgia kind of has two of those guys, in addition to a playmaking quarterback and a pretty good rushing attack and good enough receivers that you have to be honest against, and a stable of running backs. Some of them are pretty dynamic pass catchers. There's just a lot to worry about there, in addition to the most dynamic guy, which happens to be Brock Bowers at the tight end position. So I don't know. I think you could divert a lot of your attention to Michael Mayer and get away with it. I wonder if you can do that against Georgia. It's probably still the best course of action. But I don't know. I'd be curious what Jim Knowles thinks of that, because it's not, Georgia's offense is not nearly like a one trick pony the way that I think Notre Dame's is.
Yeah, and we've asked about this really since the matchup was set on Selection Sunday. What does that mean for the personnel that you choose to use to defend Georgia? What Jim Knowles is going to do there? He's obviously not going to reveal that game plan later on this morning. I thought it was interesting. I asked a number of guys, and Berman and I were there at the College Football Hall of Fame on Monday night, and just some general conversation, not trying to break any news, or the cameras weren't rolling, but just a sense for what they thought that safety situation would look like, what groups might be involved, because we've posited that Sonny Styles and Josh Proctor may have opportunities to impact this Peach Bowl, and nobody really talked about that specifically. And the reason that they didn't is they said this week, at that point on Monday night, they had not put a lot of game plan into practice. In that what I mean by that is the safeties were all still rotating, and all of them were getting prepared for a number of different looks and getting reps. And I don't know what's normal or not normal for installation for a game, but when you think about if you're in the season, Tuesdays when Ohio State would go out and have their first real practice to get ready for an opponent that Saturday. So I don't know. Maybe they're not being entirely truthful about that. Maybe they already had a better idea, but several players suggested to us that they didn't really know yet exactly how Jim Knowles wanted to defend those guys, at least in terms of having repped it on the practice field. I thought that was interesting. Tuesday they had a completely closed practice. I think that's probably where they got narrowed down the attention a little bit for what they want to do. Wednesday we'll have just 15 minutes to look at them, so we're probably not going to see a lot of great indication of of Sonny Styles popping out there in a larger personnel group. Maybe that'd be cool if they did, so that we could talk about that for the next couple of weeks or a couple of days. But yeah, I thought that was fascinating. That seems to be the approach, is that Ohio State didn't want to spend an overload amount of time putting in a game plan and emphasizing that for two weeks or so.
Yeah, I think it's different for players and coaches. Like I remember going into, I think I was in the Woody for some reason like last spring, and I think I was in Ryan Day's office briefly. Like Notre Dame film was on the TV in Ryan Day's office, and I was like, "Oh, that's interesting. That game's not for another 7 months." But I think the coaches, I think, put a lot on themselves to scout opponents and come up with plans. But I think there's a fine line between overburdening your players with preparing too much, and maybe that came out wrong. But like I think if you spend 3 full weeks game planning for Georgia, you enter the paralysis by analysis territory if you do it a little too much. So I think it's probably better for Ohio State's players that they did treat this time in Atlanta as the true game week and really dive into, like, you can watch personnel, you can watch tendencies, but like, here's how we're going to defend this, here's how we're going to attack this kind of stuff, and then put it onto the practice field. I think it makes more sense to do that this week. So I'm not surprised to hear that. But it's equally frustrating and also like makes me a little bit excited, or more excited, I guess I should say, for the game, not knowing exactly how they're going to defend this unique problem of Georgia's 2 tight ends, and whether that is a Sonny Styles or a Josh Proctor. I don't even really know who else it could be. I think it has to be those 2 guys if they wanted to do it. Although Lathan Ransom played really well against Michael Mayer, so maybe it's him too. But like, they have chess pieces to move around.
Yeah, the other part is, linebackers, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
If they wanted to get involved there, Cody Simon could play more. CJ Hicks, by the way, did not tear his ACL, so he's available for that. If
That's
Ohio
great.
State won. Yeah,
that looked nasty. Yeah,
it didn't look good. So he's walking around. He was shocked that the people thought that he had torn his ACL. He wanted to ask Berman and I where that information came from, and we said, "Well, we don't know," but
we watched it happen.
Yeah, like, it didn't look great, but we didn't say what it was because we didn't know. But it's nice for you to tell us now. CJ Hicks probably not going to be involved in that, but there is that conversation. It doesn't have to be a safety. Steel Chambers is going to have to play a role in that. Tommy Eichenberg will have to play a role in that. Obviously, those 2 guys will be involved, but they could put Cody Simon back out there. I think that he's played much better in the second half of the year when he's been involved. I thought I don't know why, if it was a rust or coming back off the injury or expecting that he was going to play a bigger role or what. I don't know. I didn't think he played all that well early on when he got in there, but he grew into that and got more comfortable and more impactful when that opportunity presented itself. So it doesn't necessarily have to be Josh Proctor or Sonny Styles. It doesn't have to come from safety. There could be an element of linebacker play as well. And that's, again, like you said, that's the fun part. Like, normally we know exactly what Ohio State intends to do with these matchups, and they don't have to get all that creative because their talent is so much better than almost everybody they play. This is a rare opportunity where it's like, well, which pieces do you want to use? They have them. but we don't know for sure exactly how they'll be deployed. That's kind of fun.
Yeah, and I guess I don't know. Did the fact that Jim Knowles put Sonny Styles on the field against Wisconsin, which again might have been, you said at the time, might have been more of an injury thing than anything else, but the willingness to do that kind of shows me that he's willing to get creative in matchups like this. And even against Michigan, like they didn't play different personnel all that much. I guess they played with some 4 linebacker looks a little more than they had in the past, but they still changed up the plan fairly drastically in terms of how much they crowded the line of scrimmage and played with zero coverage. So like Jim Knowles, one of the things I liked about him when Ohio State hired him is that he had a history of tailoring his game plans to, whatever an opponent's specific strength was. Like Ohio State's previous defenses just sort of ran out there and did the same thing every week, no matter who they were playing or what style of football it was for the most part. Jim Knowles, I think, is a little more calculated than that. So that leaves me eager to see how he approaches attacking this particular test against Georgia, because it's not. There's been a lot of talk like, oh, Georgia's built similarly to Michigan, and I think that's true to an extent, and like to the extent that they're like a big physical team, I think that's right, but Michigan's identity is lining up and pummeling you into the ground. That's not really Georgia's identity. This is a different kind of identity, I think, than Ohio State has seen this year. I don't know that there's a good 1-to-1 comparison for Georgia's offense for a team that Ohio State's played this year. In the same way, I don't think there's a good 1-to-1 comparison for Ohio State's offense that Georgia's defense has faced this year. I think these are unique challenges for both sides. But I do think, the result against Michigan, I guess, notwithstanding, I still have a fair amount of confidence in Jim Knowles' ability to put a good plan together and a plan that's tailored specifically to Georgia's strengths to help put Ohio State in the best position.
Okay. We don't know exactly which 5 Buckeyes are going to appear on later on Wednesday morning. It's also subject to change, as we found out on Tuesday with Chip Trainum coming in for Mayan Williams. I would guess that Zach Harrison and JT Tuimoloau will represent the Buckeyes. Steel Chambers, most likely. Probably not Tommy Eichenberg, because he had to appear to grunt a little bit on the Zoom on Monday. And Ronnie Hickman tends to get the nod a lot of times to go out there and represent the Buckeyes. And then I guess my last wager would be Lathan Ransom. We'll actually know beforehand, but if it's from those group of 5, who are you most interested to hear from, Bill?
Whoever on the defensive line is there, Zach, JT, maybe like a Teron Vincent, or maybe that probably be one of those 3 or 2 of those 3. The defensive line, like I wrote a story last week about the lack of quarterback sacks that Ohio State has had in big games over the last 2 years, and part of that is because sacks are just down across college football. It's just they're not as easy to come by as they used to be. Frankly, it's probably a slightly less meaningful stat than it used to be. But nonetheless, like 5 sacks total in their last like 5 quote unquote big games is not very many, and I think you'd like to see Ohio State have more. But when I wrote that, I didn't write that to suggest that Ohio State's defensive line had been playing poorly. I think they've had a really good season, especially against the run, and there have been some real bright spots in pass rushing as well. But even like against Michigan, where if you look at the pressure rate, it's like, oh, it was pretty good against J.J. McCarthy. Like I didn't consider it particularly effective because they couldn't get to him, and then when they did get to him, they let him slip away, and then he made big plays down the field. So like can and that's happened a lot this year, where they've just let slippery quarterbacks kind of get away from him, and I know that that's difficult, but Stetson Bennett, I think, is a similar kind of guy, maybe slightly less athletic than a J.J. McCarthy or like a DeQuan Finn from Toledo, but impactful in that area nonetheless. How do they corral him, keep him in the pocket, and close it on him in a way that doesn't allow him to extend plays? Because like Bobby Carpenter was talking about this on the live show on Monday, like Stetson wants to get out because he's little. He wants to get outside of the pocket and make those plays down the field. Can you keep him in there? And Ohio State's got some really big bodies with JT and Zach, and even like Tyleek, if you can get Tyleek Williams in there rushing up the middle. I think to make a quarterback uncomfortable if they can rush responsibly. And I think that's been lacking at times this year. So I guess like all of that combined is a way of me asking, like, can we see a game where we feel Ohio State's defensive line like take over in the way we've seen it do in years past? Because I feel like while it's been good, it hasn't quite been to that level this year.
I think that's the part that is maybe frustrating to watch with Ohio State when they're mobile quarterbacks and dual threat capability. Like that's a problem for everybody.
Mhm.
It's not like Ohio State is uniquely struggling with that in college football. I think that's an important reminder. We have that conversation a lot. Well, what does Ohio State struggle with? Mobile quarterbacks. Yeah, well, everybody does. You just think that they'd be better equipped maybe to handle it because, as you said, I mean, Stetson Bennett is not the biggest guy. Neither is Daquan Finn. Obviously, J.J. McCarthy's got, some decent measurable skills there. But, Zach Harrison has such freakishly long arms. Like, how does something slip away when he creates something off the edge? JT Tuimoloau is so gifted with his athleticism and can run down most of these quarterbacks. How does that happen for him? I don't think that they're the problem. The same is true for Jack Sawyer. Like, a lot of this has happened, in my opinion, because the work at defensive tackle has not been sharp enough. And how much that can change on Saturday, that depends on Mike Hall and his shoulder and the number of snaps that he gets to play. But we have seen that, Javonte Jean-Baptiste had a couple opportunities to get quarterbacks down in the backfield and let that contain slip away. I don't think that the top three guys have been bad at that necessarily, but the numbers are what they are. Ohio State's given up scramble yards and rushing yards to quarterbacks more so than they would like. So that's how do you account for that? And a lot
Mhm.
of the answer has been do your job. And Tommy Eichenberg took it one step further, and that the challenge is not like you can have a play completely defended, but you can't let up at that point. I think maybe there's been some of that, not to lean into Ohio State's bag of cliches, but the +2 element. Uh, like just because you finished your initial job doesn't mean that the play is over.
Mhm.
And I'm not suggesting that Ohio State's been bad at that, but certainly they're aware of it because they're talking about it.
Yeah, I think again, funnily enough, it seems to be the thing that's maybe lacking the most on both sides of the ball for Ohio State is what happens when a play breaks down.
Yeah.
On offense, they maybe don't take advantage of those situations enough, and on defense, they just seem to lose focus a little bit. And that's not just the defensive line; that's probably even more on the back end of the defense. And like those are hard plays. Like there's a reason why coaches are so keen on avoiding broken plays and splash plays that come off of them because they're hard to defend and it's hard to keep your focus for more than 5 seconds on a given play. I get that, but that seems to be when Ohio State has gotten burned on defense is when, for whatever reason, a guy with the ball in his hands makes a play and it's like, all right, he's in open space and like everything just sort of falls apart from there. So how do you avoid that? It's a lot of things, but I think the number one way to avoid it is by that defensive line getting after people, getting after quarterbacks more consistently than it has this year, and like it's there for sure. Like I agree with you, like JT. Zach Harrison's had a really good season. JT's had a tremendous season and like real flashes of brilliance. I think Jack Sawyer has had moments of promise as well. But if they can get those tackles going, like a healthy Mike Hall, the best version of Tyleik Williams, the best version of Teron Vincent, and you have to pay attention to those guys in the interior or not, and they're playing well, and you can let them wreck the game from the inside. Like I
Mhm.
don't know what you do against an Ohio State defensive line that's clicking on all cylinders. It just like because of injuries and maybe lapses in focus at times. I just don't know that we've seen that.
Yep, they're going to need it. Saturday night against Georgia, Ohio State Defensive Media Day is coming your way later on here down in Atlanta. Bill's going to still cover it as always back in Columbus. He'll have some stories at ohiostate.rivals.com, and we'll talk to him on the podcast daily again for Thursday, unless he gets called down to the hospital, which is always something that could happen at this time. High alert back there for the Landis crew. But we're all set for a Wednesday down here, getting ready for the Peach Bowl with Ohio State and Georgia. The Jim Knowles and a handful of Buckeyes Silver Bullets will talk. We'll have coverage of that coming your way, and we'll break it all down. That's Bill. I'm Austin. Stay tuned. A lot more coming on the podcast. Thanks for joining us on the Daily.